So, thanks for joining us to today's Bright Talk on the topic of UX meets conversational AI. Or, to be more precise, how do intelligent chatbots and co work and how do they affect the way we interact with users? And for this purpose, we've invited Sascha Wolter from Cognigy, one of our partners, to respond to a couple of questions. And from our side, we have Radek Medal, our art director, participating. Sascha, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thank you for having me. And well, I'm a so-called technology evangelist and user experience consultant, and that means I'm kind of a Swiss Army knife with blades for business, user experience, conversation design, and indeed the technology. So that means the development itself.
Thank you. And Radek, would you like to introduce yourself?
So, hi, I'm working at Bright IT at the position of art director already for 3 years, but I'm in the branch since forever, I would say 10 years or more.
Great. So let's jump straight into it. So let's start with you, Sascha. Can you sum up in short what is conversational AI?
Yes, indeed. That's my job. That's my profession. And I'm totally in it because I personally believe in the idea of conversational AI for the near future because it's about reducing the so-called gulf between humans and machines. So to make it more intuitive, more efficient, because using your voice, either in written or spoken language, is the most innate way to communicate and to interact. And well, it's quite important to mention that this is something which should be done in a cooperative manner. So that means it's not about replacing humans with so-called chatbots. It's about building something where humans and machines work alongside, support each other. Therefore, I prefer for the term conversational AI, instead of saying artificial intelligence, I prefer to call it conversational augmented intelligence, because this describes the overall idea, I think, way better. Because we want simply augment the human capabilities in a smart way. And to describe, to show you an example for that, to picture this a little bit better, just think of a concierge, a receptionist in a hotel who has studied his profession well since years, and then he finally only has to give out key cards and to answer simple questions. For example, where's the best restaurant around? And thanks to conversational AI, thanks to a bot which takes over this routine task, the receptionist now has way more time to do sophisticated things which can humans fulfill way better. So, for instance, he can now take care of the guest needs. He can Yes, indeed, he can upsell more expensive rooms, better rooms, and all this in a more empathic way, spending more time for the individual needs. And this is what we think makes up a good bot. That the good bot takes over what computers can do best, so that humans have simply more time for what can humans best.
So, what platforms and channels can conversational AI serve?
Yes, conversational AI conversations can be used through various channels. It doesn't matter how you like to call it exactly, how you like to name it. Maybe you say cross-channel, multi-channel, omni-channel. Well, there are differences between these approaches, but all in all, it describes the need of having a strategy to be on all important channels, to be available everywhere the user might be, where your target audience is, because the people are not willing anymore to search for websites, to install apps. You have to go where your target audience is. They are not willing to find you anymore. And this is something we observe, we see while talking to our customers. And this is the important aspect. And therefore, it's great to work for a company like Cognigy, where we have a conversational AI platform, which is channel agnostic. Yes, this is one of the most important parts, and which supports not only this omni-channel approach, you also can enrich your conversation with something which is called multimodal. So you can add images, galleries, if the channel supports that. You can add videos on your Echo Show screen, whatever you like to use to enrich your conversation, to make the experience with your conversational AI simply more successful, simply better.
So conversational AI is not just a chatbot.
That's true. Conversational AI simply means to guide the user through his needs in a smart way using conversation. That's the important aspect. Conversation is a very efficient, natural way of saying what you want to achieve, to formulate your intent. And conversational AI is simply there to fulfill that, to deal with that, to ask back the relevant questions.
What's your take on this, Radek?
I definitely agree that the conversational AI is not just a chatbot anymore. So with conversational AI, you need to adjust your whole thinking about the customer journey simply. It simply can be implemented, as Sascha already mentioned, across all the stages of your digital customer experience nowadays, from simple mobile app to very complex online shop or service. And you also have to think about a point of sales devices in offline world or similar scenarios. It's also not limited to text messaging anymore, but may also serve different types of content, such as audio and video or images. And even more importantly, also take these as input sources. And as Sascha already mentioned, think about augmented reality. Imagine, for example, taking a picture of your printer in order to get a user manual or simply order new cartridges without filling any form. Who wouldn't find that useful? I think your imagination is really the only limit here. And what is also important to remember that all those aspects completely change the way of how we serve the information to our customers.
So that probably puts UX designers into a new role, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're totally right. A user's interaction with a bot can be much more natural than the currently often linear interaction. For example, take a web form, where UX designers have to rethink the entire user experience if it has to work through conversations rather than through the current page-by-page approach. The tricky part in here is to adjust the user experience in the direction of conversation that feels somehow natural, but still can be well implemented using conversational AI. For sure, this is a completely new perspective for us UX designers, not in principle, of course, but in terms of outcome of UX designs.
To add something here, maybe we discussed that with our partners in conversation design workshops, because we think there's a new important role called a conversation designer, and a conversation designer somehow needs skills which are the synthesis of well, indeed, design skills, user experience skills, but combined with a strong technology understanding, plus some linguistic and psychology knowledge, and indeed some screenwriting skills. So that means he must be able to write dialogues, conversations, to understand the idea of a conversation.
Can you give an example to illustrate this?
Yes, indeed. If you start creating a classic website or mobile app, you usually have kind of a mental model of a hierarchy with menus, and then you enrich this with some buttons and so on and so forth. And there are so-called artifacts. So there are widgets, screen-based, visual-based items where you can see the purpose thanks to the visual representation. But talking about a conversational experience, that means you have to start with somehow a blank sheet of paper with a conversation. And in a conversation, you rarely have this kind of artifacts, because there's nothing on the screen so far. You start with a blank sheet with a conversation. And this is a completely different approach, which makes things more challenging, because you need to set the expectation so that the user knows what he can do. And you have to guide the user through the expectation in another way. But on the other side, the user is not bound to what you have on the screen. it's more natural. He can say whatever he wants. He can formulate, he can say, he can express his intents in a very innate way. But this is, on the other hand, it's the challenging part. The designer has to take care that the bot really does understand this natural approach.
Okay, that's interesting. So what problems can I solve with conversational AI?
And first of all, I think that AI is applicable wherever human resources would be simply too expensive. So the provided service would even be very limited or won't exist at all. So let me give you another simple example. Take a company's support help desk. Did you know that the most common issue they resolve every day is resetting passwords? This is one of the most straightforward things to solve through a bot. And then, of course, a bot is available 24/7 all over the year, and at fixed cost as well. Furthermore, you can entrust bots with tasks that no human would be happy to perform repeatedly. However, what should be mentioned here as well, broad usage of conversational AI also creates completely new questions and problems. As this topic is still very young and there is a lack of practical experience with that. Bots are getting quicker and smarter every day, but they are still far from replacing humans. They still definitely lack any kind of emotion, and this is one of the hardest things to replicate and also the biggest difference compared to the human interaction. Take the situation where a customer is very, very frustrated. A human will handle an angry caller much better than a bot will. A human decides in the moment simply what tone to use and may immediately come back with an adjusted answer. This is still extremely hard, if not impossible, to achieve with bot. And it also explains why many people are uncomfortable interacting with bots.
So what's your take on this, Sascha?
Yes, dealing with frustrated users, you mean?
To the topic in general.
In general, so you mean in terms of emotions and things like that? Yes, indeed. Language is complicated, conversation is complicated, and therefore it's hard for a bot to get the feelings, the emotions of the user and to deal with that. And this is due to the fact that we are still in the early days, indeed, yes. We are learning each day while developing bots how we can make it more natural. And this is, as said before, this is the important aspect. We don't want to make it more human-like. We want to do it more natural to make it more comfortable for the user so they don't feel somehow like stuck in an uncanny valley. They want to get simply through their task quite fast. And and talking about the idea that this is still at the beginning, even there are chatbots around since more than 50 years. If you think of Eliza, for instance, one of the first chatbots, we are technical wise and in terms of conversational design still in the early days. And to point this out a little better, a bot is kind of a virtual life form indeed. And once you have released it, it is never finished. It still learns over time. That's quite important. You can a little bit imagine that like a small puppet, like a small dog, where you have an expectation because you know this dog might give paw, this dog might get a ball, make whatever trick, and this is your expectation. And if this dog cannot fulfill your command, what you say, your intent, you are not angry about that, but you expect the dog to learn that over time. So if you come back 2 weeks later, you have the expectation that this dog has somehow improved. And this is quite similar with bots. People are usually not really annoyed if a bot sometimes does not get something because that is somehow their expectation. But if the bot does not improve over time, then they get bored and then it feels a little tedious to work with this bot. And therefore you should spend a lot of time to improve your bot over time, to improve it once it's released. And therefore it's quite important to have the right tools in place. So maybe you can think of artificial intelligence in terms of self-learning, but please be careful with that. Just look up what Tai, a Microsoft bot, happened because that was a self-learning bot which turned into a very bad bot quite soon. And on the other hand, think of kind of a content management system where you have your subject matter experts and your editors improving the bot. And if you have the right tools, then it's easy to improve it over time and to deal with maybe some states in your conversation design where the user might be frustrated, get stuck, or whatever.
Okay, wow, that's really good input. So much to theory. How about you briefly show us Cognigy.AI in action, Sascha?
Oh, yes, indeed. I was not prepared for that. So I have to see if I can do screen sharing here.
Aren't we all agile these days?
Yes, and never mind, because Cognigy.AI, even if it's an enterprise tool, it's that in quotes easy that even my son, when he was around 12, it took him 20 minutes to learn how Cognigy.AI works, and then he started to create his own bots to, yes, indeed, to annoy his friends and so on. But let's see where I can share screen here. So here it is, and here it is. Okay. So hopefully you can see here Cognigy.AI. That's our environment. This is the editor part, the content management system part of Cognigy.AI, where you build your conversational AI, your conversational experience. But this is just one part, because thanks to Cognigy.AI, all the operational aspects are already covered, because you can now think of using Cognigy.AI as software as a service or as an on-premise solution. So it's up to you where you run your bot. But where you can build it, this is the starting point. And usually you start with a project. So let's say this is my Bright IT project here, and the project embraces all the aspects of all your bots. So if there's something you like to share across bots, for instance, small talk, which is quite an important aspect, especially because people expect personality once they can talk with something. It's a little bit like, probably you know some people, like some of your friends might talk to their cars or to their cozy bears. You never know, and the bot is quite similar in terms of the expectation, and it's a very explorative experience. People like to try out a bot. And if you now have your project where you have your small talk, which you can share across all your bots, you usually start with something like a starting conversation. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. Can we switch to the English UI?
Oh, indeed. It's thank you for that.
Maybe let's quickly start over on the new project.
No, that's good to know. We can already change to that just to demonstrate that it's multilingual. That's a good aspect. So you see, you can use the interface not just in German; it also works in English, or well, it's not really my language, Japanese, or I guess that's Spain. But indeed, let's go back to the environment. And here we are in our Bright IT project. And here I now create in the English UI my first flow, my conversation starting point. And I personally prefer to give it a locale, but it's up to you how you name it. It's just a matter of your preferences. And now we get our starting point, and you see this green note here, and you can imagine this note to be your kind of brain which processes all inputs done by the user. And I start with a simple basic say note, and this say note creates the prompt, the response back to the user. So let's say that's my hello. And if I now try out my conversation, I can use the interaction panel built in, but this is just for development purpose, because you can deploy, you can expose and publish your bot through a bunch of channels. I will demonstrate that in a second, but here let's try it. If I say hi, it simply responds with this simple hello back. But indeed, this is quite a dumb bot. It only says hello. I want to make it a little bit more sophisticated. I want to add some smart capabilities. And therefore, I click on this small sign here on the left, which looks a little bit like a target circle. And here you can add so-called intents. Intents means you can either choose rules, which, for instance, look up key phrases, and depending on the key phrases, you create responses. Or on the other hand, you can use machine learning, one aspect of conversational AI, of artificial intelligence. That means I use who are you intent here, and then I write down some utterances, some example sentences. So something like, who are you? What's your name? Your name, please. And so on. Tell me your name. And this way, I train the bot. That means I create a trained model, and this model only detects if somebody says or writes something similar. Similar means the user does not have to write the exact sentences I have written here. It can say or write something only similar in terms of a semantic way, in terms of typos. It only has to be close to some of those sentences, and the computer then calculates the confidence. That's everything which happens here. So now I train my bot, and then I go back to my conversational flow. Oops, everything is here. Oh, I forgot to save the intent, and then I go back, train it, go back to my conversational flow, and here I can add a logic node to switch between several of those intents. Currently, there's only one intent, so this is quite easy. But in real projects, you have dozens or hundreds of intents, maybe also intents on several layers, which can refine the user's input in a certain manner. But anyway, now I have my intent here, and here I can add an additional say note which reacts to exactly this intent I've created before. And here I get now the name. I'm your friendly chat bot. I think that's great. Next time I get a new son, I will call him Chat probably. And now I can say again something useless, something like foo, and I get my hello. And if I ask, who are you? I hopefully get into the other branch and I get the name. And this is, according to the Pareto principle, the overall idea. Yes, to create an interface which is based somehow on intents, on getting some keywords, the user input, and then there's your fulfillment, your conversational logic dealing with that, creating responses which then give the user an answer or guide the user through the next steps. Guiding the user through the next steps means you don't have to create everything in this kind of conversational process, which is really open in terms of a conversation. The user can say whatever he wants at each point of the conversation, but sometimes you like to guide the user a little bit more. And therefore, you can create something which we call processes. And processes, I've here one, a little bit more according to your mental model of how you think of a conversation, because people think a conversation gets from one step to the other, to the next one. So let's find out what's your favorite coffee, and then you get maybe a question, and according to your questions, you go through different paths, you go through different branches of your mental model of a conversation. So this is a vertical design. But even if the Cognigy.AI takes care of getting through one step to the next one, you still can combine that with your open conversation. So if I go to my main flow here, which is using this process, I still can ask whatever I like around this process. Here you see my process where I ask for my favorite coffee and I get guided by the bot through this conversation, and then I get my response. But I still can say something like, why do you ask me that? Can you give me a description for, let's say, an espresso, and this will be forwarded to a database, and the response of this database will be then presented to the user, and so on and so forth. And this is something I can easily try out here. I can ask why, for instance, and I just want to help. You get this highlighted branch where you see what's going on. I can say something like hi, and then I get here through this branch, and the system asks back a question if I want to get a special recommendation. Yes, please. And here you see the multimodal aspects, including some images. You could add galleries depending on the channel using. And indeed, the last step to get that running is to publish it through an endpoint. And then I'm getting to an end because here you see already a bunch of endpoints for Alexa. So that means for voice experience, dialog flow. That's, for instance, maybe the Google Assistant or some other channels dialog flow supports. And here we have a web chat. Let's try out the web chat. So you'll see how it looks in practice. And yes, still I can get my recommendation, or I can write or say how to make an espresso, and so on. And most importantly, if the user gets stuck somewhere in this conversation, indeed, you easily can add to your conversation a handover feature. For instance, if you get in the default part of your conversation where you did not get any user intent, then you can use a handover node to process this, to proceed this, and to hand over this conversation to a real human. And the human then can answer and give back the control to the bot once he has done what humans can do best, so that the bot can do what the bot can do best.
Wow, thank you. That was really interesting. Okay. So coming back to the customer journey that was mentioned a few times, how will it differ from what we are already used to?
I would see the onset of bots as a simply logical step in the evolution of professional and business communication. So let's have a very quick look at the evolution from the first merchant in ancient marketplaces to AI-driven digital marketing that was currently presented to us. So first there was just a spoken word. Yeah, it was great, but it had some limitations, definitely. And it was therefore replaced and improved by so-called revolutionary print a couple of 100 years ago. Then, with some tiny steps in between, came the internet, a real game changer. It evolved into more interactive so-called Web 2.0, as we all know it, with more and more internet-enabled devices. And with the rise of artificial intelligence, the personalization has started to be at the center of digital communication. We are increasingly headed towards so-called audience of one, which ultimately is where it all started. So every individual customer is served in a highly individualized way. And intelligent bots are certainly one of the pioneers of this development.
Can you give me an actual example of where and how conversational AI may change user interaction?
As I've already mentioned, using bots allows us to break the limits of existing communication channels. For example, we are not limited anymore by the somewhat linear character of a normal website. Let's say that you just had a minor car accident and there are just a few scratches on your car, but of course your mood is not the best. And you still have to claim that damage with your car insurance in Illinois. Currently, you probably have three options. Either you give a call to your insurance agent, but the problem rises, how will you share the images of your damage? Or you can send an email, but do you know beforehand which details the insurance requires? Me not. And last but not least, you can go to the insurance website and fill out a very long and complex damage claim form with half of the information probably useless in the end. So now, what if I told you that all this can be solved by using conversational AI in a way that makes the simple, more pleasant conversation, but would calmly guide you through the whole situation at your own pace, skipping all the unnecessary steps. And furthermore, if something goes wrong, you will still have the option to speak to a human being. That sounds pretty convenient.
Maybe.
That's one example that I think by now you get the conversational AI as a real game changer. I guess that we'll probably see this more and more for very, very good reasons.
So, what's your take on this, Sascha?
Yes.
How may conversational AI change the customer journey?
Yes, absolutely. But I like to take another point of view because it's when to use conversational AI and how you can find where it has a value to the user. And this is something we call a micro moments. It's about finding moments where you can fulfill a routine task, a conversational task using your voice or a written language. And this is a challenging part, to find those moments. Just imagine situations more or less which are kind of multitasking. This is a good demonstration of where conversation makes sense. So you're in the kitchen doing something, preparing your meal, your hands are busy. And in this case, it absolutely makes sense that you can do in parallel something different. So multitasking, you can ask how's the weather, which ingredients do I need for this meal or whatever. You can do two things at one time while your hands are busy. Yes, if you're in the living room carrying around your baby, you simply can't drop it to get the current weather. Yes, this is one more example for that. And if you now think about business purposes, just imagine you are having a ride driving yourself. Your hands are busy and indeed your eyes are focused on the street, but you want to finish some important tasks. And this is exactly one moment where conversational AI might help you. And it's about finding those moments. And as you already said, you can find those moments if you have a look on the typical user journey, when over the day the user might use your system, your product, and how can conversation help in this situation. And this is one point of view, to see the user journey. So let's say somebody in the morning is showering, and while under the shower he wants to ask for his upcoming appointments. Yes, this is something you can do while having a conversational AI solution. Or just have a look on the customer journey. That's a different point of view on your scenarios, on your challenges. So just imagine one of your customers, he wants to buy your product, is searching for some inspiration. And in this case, if you would have an expert supporting your customer, and this expert is available 24 hours, 7 days a week, and can give some recommendations, can answer some questions, then this is a very efficient way of using conversational AI to support the customer journey, from inspiration to buying the product, maybe financing. Then you need some guidance how you can buy the product and really pay for that. Even you can support the delivery process. And in the end, you also can ask the user via conversational AI, what's about sharing your experience, what's about recommending the product to your friends, what's about some loyalty benefits, things like that. And at all those points during the conversation, at all those points in the user journey or customer journey, it makes sense to think about a conversational AI.
So what about privacy though?
Yes, indeed. This is a very important aspect, and therefore I'm quite glad that you have, using Cognigy.AI, you have full control about the GDPR aspects. You can control which aspects of your conversation will be saved, stored to improve the conversation. You can choose which you want to see, which data you want to see in your analytics data. to measure the success of your bot, to improve it furthermore. And indeed, you can also use something we call a blind mode, where nothing is recorded, to make it as secure, as private as you like, to have full control. And yes, because it's also available as an on-premise solution, you have the full control of everything which is happening in Cognigy.AI in your conversations.
So let's get practical. What do I need to do in order to set up conversational AI for my service?
So from the UX perspective, you first of all need to know who are the customers and what are their needs. And at this stage, it's really very similar to your normal marketing activities. So we work with so-called personas who more or less represent typical customer types, and I would definitely recommend you to do as well. Only when you understand your audience, you can also think about what a typical conversation with them will look like. So based on that, you can start thinking about which part of the communication can be automated or moved to the bot. And definitely, as the next step, I would recommend you to directly involve an expert as Sascha here on conversational AI, who will greatly speed up the next steps.
Well, let's involve the expert then. What are the next steps, Sascha?
Yes, I was just a second away from my screen to get some paperwork, because what we are doing is we start with something, hopefully you can see that, we call how to make a toast drawing method. This is something where you capture moments in kind of a doodling style. So that means you doodle your moments during the customer or the user journey. And for instance, this is this is quite a rude one. Hopefully you can see that here. This is one of those moments we used we experienced doing workshops. This one is, oh, I have an accident and I want to ask my conversational AI, how much blood can I lose until I die? Well, that's a harsh one. This one is a consumer one, quite obvious. I'm in a shop. I want to know where's the toothpaste, and it would be awesome to have this in your shops, simply to ask in each row, where can I find that in this one, or this one is this is under the shower, whatever you can imagine. And we have a bunch of those drawings, but in our workshops, it's up to our attendees to create their own doodles of such scenarios, to find some ideas, moments, and then we use something like this. This is our user journey, where people point out what they're doing during the day. Here's the customer journey. Yes, and finally, this all leads to something we call a happy pass. Happy pass means they write sample dialogues. Sample dialogues means it's a little bit like screenwriting, so they are acting how it might work with a bot. And to improve this acting, we take this happy pass where you write what the user says and how the bot responds in terms of a dialogue. We use the single turns and we create something we call intent cards. So we copy the conversation to single cards. On the front of those cards is the user intent, and on the back there we write down how the bot responds. And then it's a little bit like a small card game. We play that. So one person is the bot with all those cards, and the other one is the tester, and he says something, and the virtual bot, the person acting like a bot, he takes these cards and looks up, do I have a card which can deal with that? How do I respond to this? And indeed, as you already mentioned, we combine that with simple personas to improve the overall experience, to see what's the personality of the bot, if the bot needs a personality. Yes, that's what we're doing.
Wow, thanks for sharing all the secrets.
Yes, I believe in the idea of conversational AI, so I don't want to have secrets. I want to support as much people as possible to get into that.
Maybe coming to a little bit trickier question here. So can you give us a reference point for how do I plan for a conversational AI project in terms of budgeting?
Yes, I've shown these intent cards, and there are kind of this the smallest entity to measure the effort. So each turn of a conversation somehow has an average time you need to implement it. Yes, indeed, you need to consider conception, the overall design, personality, and so on. This is something where you have to spend some work. And then it's about to getting all the single turns in your conversation just to measure, to estimate how much effort might this bot need. So for instance, if you have simple FAQs, then it's easy to get all the turns. So the user asks something and then the bot responses. So this is easily to calculate. And then you get into the processes. Each step is one turn. And if you have more complex models where you have to gather some data, let's say an order model where you need the product, the color of the product, the size, and the count of the pieces you like to order. So these are, let's say, 4 properties of your model. So this is literally 4 turns. And if you add all those together, if you sum up all those single turns, you can somehow estimate the effort, multiply that with all the channels you want to develop, because you usually have to add a little bit of work for each channel, for the specific aspects of a channel. And you also, and this is very important not to forget, because this is the initial effort for a bot to release it once. But in the next step, you have to take into account the editorial work once the bot is released. Yes, the operational aspects indeed. So what does it cost to run a platform? But on top of that, you need the editorial work. You need somebody who improves the bot each week. But this is just one side of the costs, because this way you can estimate how much it might cost. But on the other hand, it's way easier to calculate how much money you can save while creating a bot. Just imagine you have, let's say, 5,000 people a day calling your support center for resetting their password. And even if this takes only 5 minutes for each person, but if you can automate that, if it's highly automatable, then you might save 95% here in terms of human work to solve these issues. And if you calculate 5,000 with 5 minutes, even if you only automate 95% here, and if your employee might take 50 euros per hour to solve things like that, you can save 20,000 euros a day. And this is a huge amount in terms of automating service calls, routine tasks, frequently asked questions, processes. So this is something which you should compare with the overall effort, how much you can save.
So, I mean, to sum it up, I basically can look at the cost side, and I can look at the existing service, how much it costs for a reference point.
Yeah, how much you can save, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much to the both of you for your interesting input. Would you like to add some last words, Sascha?
Well, I only can invite everybody to start doing that. We have, for instance, a community platform where you can make your first experience for free. Yes, just getting into the idea of conversational AI. And well, I only can speak for myself, but it's not only useful, it does not only make the human-machine communication interaction more natural, it also is a lot of fun. And therefore, I only want to thank you for inviting me to this webinar.
Well, thank you. And Radek, from your side, any last words?
Yeah, so I would as well, Sascha, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Definitely. What I'm looking forward right now is that the future of whatever we are trying to create here seems to be very, very inviting. And I think this audience of one topic is something that we have to look forward, because it will totally change our thinking about providing any information to our customers. So thanks again, and hope to join you for any other webinar in the future.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.